Welcome to the Global Philosophy of Religion project at the University of Birmingham, run by Professor Yujin Nagasawa. Because philosophy of religion in Closer to Truth's meaning category has been viewed from largely a Christian philosophical perspective, we appreciate this opportunity to engage with diverse philosophies of religion from the world's great religious traditions. Here we interrelate and correlate topics and questions in Christian philosophy of religion with those of diverse non-Christian traditions with respect to closer to truth's kinds of topics and questions. Chad Meister is professor of philosophy and theology and chair of the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Bethel University. He is also a faculty affiliate of the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion at the University of Notre Dame. His primary research interests are the problem of evil, concepts of God, and, very relevant, comparative religion. Chad, welcome. Let's begin with a brief overview of Christian philosophy, especially regarding the topics addressed and questions posed.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate the dialogue here that we'll have together. So philosophy has played a very important role in the history of Christianity. In fact, a number of the central doctrines of the Christian faith have important philosophical presuppositions and implications. And so throughout the history of the faith, there have been theologians who have utilized the tools of philosophy to help articulate the doctrines, to help defend them, to help develop them, and so forth. And so there's been this really helpful relationship. In fact, philosophy has been seen historically as the handmaiden of theology, and but it's also had its detractors. So both outside of the Christian faith, there have been those who have utilized the tools of philosophy to aggressively argue against it. But there have also been theologians within the Christian faith that have seen philosophy as unhelpful. In fact, one of the most important theologians of the early 3rd century, Tertullian, asked the question, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem, the academy, with the church? And you can see this sort of tension running throughout Christian history. So you have some of the great philosophers and theologians of Christian history, Augustine, Aquinas, Anselm, for example, who are trained in both philosophy and theology and utilize the tools of philosophy to try to help develop the doctrines and so forth. But then you also have people who have been opposed to philosophy throughout Christian history. Even two of the great Reformed theologians, John Calvin and Luther, both wrote against certain forms of philosophy, especially the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. So there's been this tension that we've found throughout Christian history.
How about in recent times? Christian philosophy has had a real resurgence over the last few decades after people had assumed it would be in decline, whether it was logical positivism approach in the early 20th century. People assumed religious philosophy was disappearing. And then there was this dramatic resurgence. And today, Christian philosophy is a very vibrant area.
Yes, that's right. Today, there are many philosophers who are Christians and a number of theologians who are utilizing the tools of philosophy in their work. In fact, there's a new sort of a field in theology called Analytic Theology, which is utilizing the tools of analytic philosophy to help articulate the doctrines, to clarify arguments, and so forth. And so there hasn't been a research.
We have focused on analytic theology, so that's one of our closer to truth topics. So that's good. What are some of the core issues or topics or doctrines that are susceptible to philosophical and particularly analytic philosophical analysis?
Yeah, so some of the core doctrines throughout Christian history continue to be important. So, for example, the doctrine of the Trinity, which was developed and articulated in the early centuries of the church, utilizing the tools and the language of Greek philosophy, which we see reflected in some of the early creeds, like the Nicene Creed. So the doctrine of the Trinity has been one of those doctrines that throughout history has utilized philosophical ideas. They've been utilized to develop the doctrine. That continues on today. So there's still a discussion. In fact, there was a recent symposium on the doctrine of the Trinity which consisted of a number of leading analytic philosophers of religion who are engaged.
One can understand the need with the one God and the three centers of personality or consciousness. And I know you were responsible for putting that symposium together, and I appreciate it, and I enjoyed the material. So let's look today to the relationship between Christian philosophy and the philosophies of religion of other diverse traditions. And so, since you have focused on comparative religion and comparative philosophy, can you just give some basic principles for relating Christian philosophy to the philosophies of other religious traditions? In other words, Christian philosophy in comparison with or in contradiction to the philosophical views of other religious philosophies?
Yeah, that's an important question. Let me begin by saying this. I think over the last couple of decades, it's been important to recognize that philosophy of religion is a global phenomenon. So there are philosophers across the religious traditions who have been engaging in philosophical thinking about their traditions. And in the West, in the United States, for example, there has been, up until recent times, a pretty strong emphasis on Christian philosophy and the ideas related to that, and Christian theology and philosophical theology, and then analytic theology, as I mentioned. But what's happening is there has been, again, this realization by many of us that the philosophy of religion is occurring across, the religious traditions. And so one of the interests that I've had personally is to learn from others. And I think this is something that as a philosopher, we should do. That is, we should try our best to learn from other traditions. So I would say in terms of principles, that's a very important principle for contemporary philosophers of religion. That is to try our best to learn about other traditions, to learn about, say, what they're doing in metaphysics, how they're understanding the nature of ultimate reality, to look at matters of ethics, how they understand right and wrong and moral values, how they look at soteriological principles, and so forth, and even practical matters. I think are important for those of us who are doing philosophy of religion today. So, for example, what is interfaith dialogue, and how can we be engaged in that? How can we fruitfully engage in that kind of a practice? And so there's much.
As we go through the various topics, if you can, and when appropriate, if you can, because we're going to deal with very specific, we're not going to just stay here in the general, we're going to drill down on very specific topics. As you can, point out where there are areas of agreement, or if there are disagreements, is that disagreement sort of superficial? And if you dig down, maybe there's more commonality. And then where are irreconcilable differences or real conflicts? Because we have to, we can't just be kind of a kumbaya approach to this. We all want to know reality. So we want to distinguish those different kinds of categories. So now let's go through some of the topics and questions that we pose to diverse philosophers of religion from non-Christian traditions in our Global Philosophy of Religion project, in particular in this first part of the project, which is the existence and nature of God or deities. So we want to get the responses or the reactions from Christian philosophy to these same kinds of questions. So let's start with the core idea of existence of God or deities. And as you look at, and as we've both in our careers gone through all the arguments for and against the existence of God, as you've seen some of those same kinds of approaches in other religious traditions, arguing for and against the existence of God, how would you compare those kinds of arguments with the arguments that are found in the Christian tradition?
Yeah, I think if you look at what are oftentimes referred to as the Abrahamic faiths, so Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, there you have many of the same types of arguments that have been running through historically, that continue on even today. So looking at various forms of the cosmological argument, in the design argument, the moral argument. You even find forms of this in Hinduism, in certain streams of Hindu thought. You have these same kinds of arguments dating back many, many centuries, in fact. So when you're talking about thinking about divine reality as a God, a personal God, some kind of transcendent reality that has attributes such as omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and so forth, creativity, purpose, will, intention, then you find these same types of arguments. When you look at some of the other traditions, though, let's say coming out of China, if you look at, take for example, Confucianism or Taoism, generally speaking, you don't have those same types of arguments for the existence of a transcendent reality. You have more of experience supporting those beliefs. I do want to add, though, that while, of course, there are major differences between the way the different religious traditions think about the transcendent, there are also some commonalities. And I think that's a helpful point to think about, because there's a difference between, let's say, an atheistic way of thinking about the world and a religious way of thinking about the world. And if you look at the major world religions, they all have some agreements, such as the idea that there is a transcendent reality, that the material universe is not all that there is, that there's something far beyond that. And that beyond, whether we're talking about, say, Yahweh, or whether we're talking about Allah or Brahman or the Tao, that reality gives meaning and purpose to life. And so I think that unifying theme, just that one unifying theme, can be helpful as we think about the existence of a transcendent reality, especially in contrast to the notion of atheism. So that's a helpful place to begin, I think.
Good. Okay, what do we do with the problem of evil? This comes up in obviously every religious tradition, one way or another. You focused on it. So from a standpoint of comparative religions, discuss the problem of evil.
Yeah, that's an important question. So what's interesting is basically all of the major traditions deal with evil. So if you look at Buddhism, for example, you have the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth is that, it's a recognition of suffering throughout the world. And then as you work through the noble truths, the conclusion is, how do we escape this? If you look at Hinduism, the problem of evil is a fundamental issue there. It's the same across the tradition. So it's a problem that everybody has to address. It seems especially focused on the religions which are clearly theistic, the idea that there's an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, person-like God, or God with person-like qualities. That's, the problem seems to be pointed there, because the idea is, if there is such a God, then why would God allow there to be the amount and extent, the gravity of pain and suffering that exists in the world? But I should add that, again, it's a problem for everybody. And also, it's not just a problem for religious adherents. The problem of evil, really, it seems to me, is a problem for anybody. Because let's say that a person doesn't hold to the idea that there is a God or a transcendent reality. Then one could ask the question, what is evil? Is there such a thing as objective right and wrong, good and bad, and so forth? And if there is, what makes it so? And so a number of recent atheist authors and philosophers and so forth have written about this in an attempt to try to explain that. And I find it very fascinating that this is happening, especially over the last decade or so. There's been quite a number of atheist philosophers attempting to respond to the problem of evil. So it's not just a problem for religious adherents, though it is a very big problem for religious adherents, especially theists.
Well, from an atheistic point of view, they have to deal with the problem of evil, but the simple overarching answer is this is what you would expect if the world is by chance and operating by the laws of physics at whatever deep level that has no will or intent or teleological purpose. So the presence of evil is exactly what you would predict.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, because if you think about what we mean by that term, so let me give you an example of why this is a problem, I think. So the atheist Ted Bundy, he was interviewed by his attorneys after he was caught. He was caught and went to trial and so forth, convicted of raping and murdering a number of people. And when he was asked about that, what was he thinking about as he was contemplating this? His response, I've actually written about this, and I have a quotation from him. His response is basically that there is no such thing as objective right and wrong. It's just whatever I feel like, right? I mean, how can there be, he says, how can there be some kind of right and wrong if there is no God, for example? It seems like it's just a matter of my own opinion. So if I want to harm somebody, we call that evil. But why do we call that evil? I mean, what if I like it? What makes it evil? And so it's this notion of what makes something good or what makes something bad that I think is the real problem on the atheistic account. Now, again, one could say that, you could go the route, well, it's a social construct. You could say that it's relative to individuals or culture. You could maybe affirm some kind of utilitarian principle, or you could go some other way. But again, it is a problem that has to be dealt with. And so if we're going to say oppose, I don't know, eugenics, for example, and say, no, this is wrong, we should not do that. If we're going to oppose racism, this is something that we should not be supportive of. We should be condemning racism. The question is, okay, why? What makes something like that wrong? Or take the classic example of that it's evil to torture a baby for fun to death. Okay, well, what makes that evil? Is it just a matter of feeling, I don't like that, that disgusts me, or is it truly, in fact, evil? And so, in fact, there have been several leading atheist philosophers recently who said that the notion of morality is merely an illusion that evolution has gotten us to believe so that we can survive better. So if it's just an illusion, then that seems problematic, and then you can't really make these kind of moral distinctions that I think are intuitive for all of us, that there really are things that are evil, there really are things that are good.
The general problem that religions have, certainly theistic religions, Abrahamic traditions in particular, is to reconcile an all-powerful, all-knowing God with a God that is supposedly all omnibenevolent, all good. And all free. So how do you reconcile that? That's what has been dealt with. You've dealt with it, and many others have. We focused on it on Closer to Truth a great deal. There's another view that goes back maybe to Zoroastrianism that also appears that recognizes this reality, but rather than trying to explain it away or explain it in some theodicy, it recognizes that these are the realities of existence, that there's good and then there's evil. And then they infer from that the nature of reality is both good and evil, and maybe they're kind of co-equal. And this is the fundamental substrate of reality. You can disagree or don't like the conclusion, but in a sense, the dealing with the raw data, they do it in a way that is perhaps less contradictory than the theodicies that we all play with.
Yes, that's right. There are also some forms of Hindu thought that include the idea that ultimate reality, Brahman, consists of both good and evil. That is true, and I think for me, this is a matter of plausibility. What's the most plausible way to think about ultimate reality? What's the most plausible way to think about goodness? What's the most plausible way to think about evil? And, we have to come to our own conclusions on these things, obviously. But it seems to me, I have a number of reasons for affirming the idea of God as a maximally perfect being. And so if that's the case, then by nature, such a reality would not entail evil. And then we can ask the question, well, what do we mean by evil? If you look back, say, in Christian history, Augustine, who took an argument from an earlier Neoplatonic thinker, Plotinus, argued that evil is not a thing. It's not a reality. It's not a substance, like a planet or a person or something like that. He said it's a privation and misdirected will. So I think there's some plausibility, in my opinion, to that idea, though I think we also have to be careful that we don't say, well, since evil is not a thing, God's off the hook, because even though evil might not be a substance, certainly evil exists. Evil exists, right? And so if evil exists, then the question is, well, first of all, where did it come from? And secondly, why doesn't God deal with it? And so those, I think, are the two primary questions to examine. And here again, I think it's helpful to divide up the way we think about evil into the two categories that are commonly analyzed in the literature on this, where you have moral evil, that is evil that moral agents perpetuate. You have people who commit murder, other types of crimes, violent acts, and so forth. And then you have natural evil, those events that occur in the world, like tornadoes or hurricanes, which bring about some amount of physical or mental pain or anguish. And I think when it comes to moral evil, it does seem to me plausible to think that there could be a contradiction between the notion of God creating free agents who only do good, if they're truly free. And so it could be that in order to create a world like this, in which there are free agents who can engage in such activities as loving others, being compassionate, and so forth, that having that kind of libertarian freedom is essential.
Yeah, no doubt the theodicy industry will not be going away. Let's move on to ways of knowing God in the Christian versus other traditions. In terms of the importance of religious or mystical experiences, we're dealing now with more of an analytic approach, but what about the experiential? How does that compare?
Yeah, so throughout Christian history, there have been groups of people that are oftentimes referred to as Christian mystics. And what's fascinating for me is that as you look at the other traditions, whether it's Judaism, Hinduism, Islam, and so forth, you also find a group of people that are identified as mystics. And so oftentimes what happens is, and this happened, I think, to a great extent in the Christian tradition, you have those who are coming from that mystical tradition, and then others who are coming from a more analytic tradition, philosophical, logical tradition, who are a bit at loggerheads. And I think that much can be learned, in my opinion, much can be learned from both those who are practicing the more logical approach, the theological approach to the nature of God and ultimate reality, and from those who are engaged in mystical experiences. In fact, in some ways, I consider myself a person who engages in both. And so I often go on spiritual retreat and have had some experiences that I would identify as mystical experiences. And so then after I experience those, my analytic side kicks in and I try to think about the nature of those. And oftentimes that gets not very far. But I think that there is value in both of these traditions. And again, we see them across the spectrum of religions. And I think there is much that can be learned here as we not only look at the history of our own tradition of, say, mystical experiences, but as we do some comparative work between those experiences that are written about and discussed in the Christian tradition and those in these other traditions as well.
Yeah, I've had the experience in being in a very religious study places, yeshivas in Judaism, madrasas in Islam, equivalent places in Hinduism. And if I didn't know specifically where I was, I would have difficulty distinguishing the whole sociological, psychological processes in each. I think the one thing we know for sure is that humanity is given to these kinds of mystical experiences and mystical and laying on them some deep relationships to reality. And that cuts across all humanity and all of the religions we look at. I think that's a very significant data point in understanding.
I think so too. And I think there are conclusions that can be drawn from that, both conclusions that are, say, idiosyncratic to the individual who's having those experiences. So, for example, for some people, these mystical experiences can be so powerful, so profound, so, in fact, self-authenticating that they, after having these experiences, have no doubts, say, about the existence of God or their relationship with God or that God loves them or something like that. And so then I think, but that doesn't mean, because they've had this profound experience, that doesn't mean, say, that somebody else who hasn't had that experience can then draw that same conclusion that God exists or that God is love and so on. But I do think that given the vast number of these experiences, perhaps there are some general conclusions that can be drawn. And so we could, take a careful look at maybe what those conclusions would be. But I think it's important to, realize that there is this plethora of types of experiences. Sometimes experiences are divided up between religious experience and mystical experiences, but nevertheless, they are universally had by practitioners of faith, and sometimes even by those who consider themselves non-religious at all. So yes, there are universally experienced mystical events that happen. And in fact, as I said, I personally have had a few of these. And in my own case, I have drawn some conclusions from those experiences, including the fact that I think there is a transcendent reality. So for me, it's this personal experience that counts as evidence for a God that I couldn't necessarily use, in dialogue with somebody who hasn't had those experiences. In fact, I think in some instances, people who have never had such experiences might use that as evidence against the existence of God or transcendent reality.
Let's deal with the core question in comparative religion, and that is, do all religions, from the standpoint of the religion you're talking about, worship the same God or the same deity or the same reality? The question of universalism versus particularism.
Yeah. So I want us to be kind of nuanced here as we explore this question, because it's a very complex question. So I think we have to make a difference between the referent, the thing that we're talking about, and then the concept or the mental construct that we utilize to talk about that thing. So let me give you an example that might be helpful. So suppose there's an automobile accident and 4 people witnessed the accident. And then when the police arrived, they asked these 4 people who observed the accident, what kind of vehicle was the main vehicle involved in the accident? And you might have one person say, it was a blue Ford, and another person say, no, it was a gray Chevy, and another person say, no, it was some kind of a brown Toyota or whatever. This commonly occurs when accidents happen. And so as these people are thinking about that object, that referent, that vehicle, they have a concept in their mind of what that vehicle was. And it could be that they all have a concept that's false. Maybe it was maybe it was a red Ferrari. And so there's a difference. My point is there's a difference between the concept or the construct in the person's mind that they have about the referent and then the referent itself, right? So suppose it actually was a blue Ford. That's the actual referent, but then the concepts that are attempting to point toward the referent might not be accurate. So with that sort of analogy in mind, when we think about the different religious traditions, one way to think about them is that, well, there is the transcendent reality, God, and then each of these traditions has a construct or a concept in which they are trying to understand, encapsulate this idea about that transcendent reality. Now, some philosophers of religion who are called pluralists would hold the idea that this is in fact what happens, and because there's, say, a great veil between our enculturated concepts and the transcendent reality, we can never actually make that connection. And so no one actually would really know if their construct matches that reality. So a pluralist would say something like that. And then if you ask, are all the religions worshiping the same God? Well, you might say, well, they're all attempting to. They're all focusing on their own concepts, and they're attempting to get at that reality. Another way to think about it, though, keeping that same analogy, is that, well, perhaps that there has been some focused revelation. Say one particular tradition has revelation that's more developed or more enhanced or more clear about God. Perhaps God, if God exists, in fact, did reveal God's self in profound ways through the prophets. And so then in that case, let's say, for example, in Christianity, suppose that the authors of the New Testament had insight about, God and so forth. And so therefore, their concept of God is closer, suppose, to the referent than maybe some of the other traditions. So then you could ask, okay, well, suppose that's the case. then the Christians are focused on that concept and worshiping the God that they're referring to. But other traditions, maybe they're missing the mark, or maybe they're not. And so this is where you have the pluralists that I mentioned, but then you also have a group called Inclusivist who would say that that's basically what's going on, and that there is one tradition that's capturing better that conceptual understanding of the referent God, and so when they're worshiping God, they have a better construct that's connecting to the reality. But oftentimes the Inclusivists would add that those in the other traditions, they may be also worshiping God. It's just that the referent isn't as accurate as the others.
It does get a little more pointed than that, because some traditions would say that unless you do it my way, you're not going to get whatever is the soteriological, the salvation, the reward at the end. In Christianity, Jesus is the only way. Other religious traditions have something similar, although there are certainly many Eastern religions that have a broader understanding of how to approach the ultimate.
Yeah, so within each of these traditions, let's stick with the Abrahamic traditions for a minute. There is this category called exclusivist, religious exclusivist, who would hold that not only do you have to have the construct accurate, but the propositions about what it means to be saved and so forth are also key for achieving salvation. So these other traditions, on this view, then, since they don't have the right propositional content, they couldn't be saved. But you find these three different streams that I was mentioning, or three different views, rather, of salvation: this exclusivist view, the inclusivist view, and the pluralist view. You find those in each of the major religious traditions today, and you find them even historically. So as you pointed out, Robert, in some of the Eastern traditions, especially in Hinduism, there has been this broader inclusivism and even pluralism that's been held historically. But you also find inclusivism in Christianity. You find it in Judaism and Islam historically, and today as well.
Let's talk about the traits, the characteristics, the attributes of God or the deities from each of the traditions. And I start with what I think is perhaps the most important point, is that the personal proposition about God or something like God. Is God a personal being with personhood features like awareness, intent, will, desire? How do you relate the traditions of the world to the Christian tradition?
Yeah, let me begin with the Christian tradition, because there you actually have some disagreements about the attributes of God today in the what are oftentimes referred to as classical theists, who affirm the attributes that you mentioned. So they're somewhat person-like, but not necessarily the kind of person that one might want in thinking about God. So, for example, with classical theists, going back, let's take the perhaps paragon case of Thomas Aquinas. He held to the idea that God had certain person-like qualities that you mentioned, but then when we think about other attributes that Aquinas and other classical theists affirm, it seems that God isn't the kind of person that we might think God should be. So, for example, the idea that God is impassible is a part of classical theism. And impassibility is this idea that God is not influenced or impacted by anything outside of God, anything external to God. So God is not, in a sense, influenced and impacted by my prayers. God doesn't feel my pain. God doesn't suffer in any way. One might wonder how that's person-like. And so many contemporary philosophers, Christian philosophers, hold to a view that's sometimes called theistic personalism or personalistic theism, in which they include those attributes, those person-like attributes that you mentioned, but also include other more affective ones, in which God has feelings, God has emotions, God suffers when we suffer, God experiences
a lot relates to how you think God relates to time. Because is God eternal in the sense of no beginning and no end, but in time, or timeless outside of time? If you're outside of time, then everything sort of is happening at once, and there's no opportunity, if you will, to change. So therefore, the impassibility of God is related to God's relationship to time. So I think these questions get get deeper.
Yes, you are certainly right. And there's a lot of discussion in contemporary philosophy of religion about time and God's relation to time. And there are the A theorists who think that God is flowing through time, and the B theorists who think that God is static and time itself is static. So, this gets into the philosophy of time, and it gets into other scientific questions as well. But back to the point about the different religious traditions. So within Christianity, you have these sort of different views where in the classic view, God is really not quite as person-like as many people want today. You also have those same discussions happening in the other Abrahamic traditions. So you have these discussions happening in Judaism as well as in Islam. In Hinduism, there has been a notion of God being person-like, really, back for thousands of years, more person-like even than you find in the Abrahamic faiths. And so there you have God reflected in various deities, various incarnations, which are very, very human-like. And so within the Hindu tradition itself, there are contemporary discussions about how to understand these different depictions of God in the sacred texts. So you have, for example, in Hinduism, 6 streams of philosophy or philosophical schools. Perhaps the most prominent one called Vedanta. And in this Vedanta school, even in that one school, you have 3 different understandings about God and God's manifestation. You have the Advaita Vedanta, or that God is non-dual. It's a monistic pantheistic view. You have the Vishishtadvaita Vedanta view. That's a qualified non-dualism. And then you have what's called Dvaita Vedanta, in which it's very dualistic, very much like classical theism in the Abrahamic faiths. So Hinduism has a plethora of views of thinking about what God is like, but most of them include something that's very person-like. It includes person-like attributes and qualities, including these affective ones. And this is another place that's, I think, really ripe for interfaith discussion, interfaith dialogue, comparative work, to see how we can learn from one another. If I might add one point here, Robert, in my own studies, I spent quite a bit of time studying Hindu thought, in particular Vishishtadvaita Vedanta thought, and there's much that I've learned from that tradition, including the notion of the immanence of God. I think in the Abrahamic faiths, at least over the last, let's say, couple of centuries, it seems that there's been a pretty strong emphasis on the transcendence of God, but a real lack of emphasis and understanding on the immanence of God. And so my own work, dealing with this Vishishtadvaita tradition has been very enlightening in thinking about God in more immanent ways.
A sharp distinction between the Abrahamic traditions, particularly from Christian philosophy and others, is what is called perfect being theology, which in the Christian tradition says God is that which nothing greater can be conceived, and therefore derive from that the omnipotence, the omniscience, the omnibenevolence, all free, etc. In looking at these characteristics of the most perfect God, the concept of change seems to be called an imperfection. That does not seem to be the case in other religious traditions.
Yeah, so in the Abrahamic faiths, again, which were to a great extent influenced by Greek philosophy, one of the notions of the ancient Greek philosophers was that change is not a good thing, because if you have, let's say, God who's changing, then he must either be changing for the better or changing for the worse. In either case, you wouldn't have a perfect being. So they disliked that notion of change in thinking about God, and that idea worked its way into Christian and Jewish and Islamic thought, and held sway for a very long time. But over the last, I'll say several centuries, the notion of change with relation to God has really developed a lot of interest. There are quite a number of philosophers now who would see change in a positive light, both in terms of the natural world, but also in terms of thinking about God. So this is where I think there's something beneficial in thinking about God in a sort of dipolar way. That is, that there's an unchanging dimension of God. So God's omniscience, God's omnibenevolence never changes. But then if God is in fact engaged with human beings, for example, through time, then it seems that there would be change happening in God, because there are experiences that God would be having now, if a person is praying now, say, that God wasn't having, yesterday. And so if we think of God in the sort of dipolar way, that there's a changing aspect and an unchanging aspect, I think it makes a lot of sense of both the tradition of the sacred texts and also of our own personal experiences.
In seeking to harmonize views of God by diverse religions, the Christian Trinity seems an obstacle, in that all other religions seem to be unified in their denial of it. Yet even within the Christian traditions, there are now differing opinions, maybe more so. You edited this special issue of Philosophia Christi on rethinking the Trinity. Would rethinking the Trinity help harmonize diverse religions with Christianity?
I think it could. So, one of the things that Christianity has affirmed from the very beginning is a strong monotheism, right? So Christianity has always affirmed that there is only one God, that there's not another God. And so the question becomes, within Christianity, if you have God manifest as three persons, then don't you have three gods? And so isn't that polytheism? So this has been the tension, from early on. But a lot of the work recently has been done in focusing on what the ancient theologians meant by the term person. We've now had many centuries of psychology to help us think about the nature of a person. When the framers, say, the crafters of the Nicene Creed, were thinking about this, they weren't using the same kind of language. And so, in my own opinion, I think some theologians have gone a bit too far with the person aspect. And I don't really know how, if you take the ontology of person seriously, and you have three persons, I don't see how you can, not have three gods. So I think a lot of the work that's been really helpful is thinking of the notion of God as three persons as not three full-blown ontological personalities with individual ego and so forth. And so that's where the work is going. And I think there's a lot of rich work that can be done here, because if we're thinking about God in monotheistic terms, and we can emphasize the monotheism and make clear to people of other traditions that we're not talking about polytheism, then I think we can go a long way in having mutual understanding of one another. Because it is blasphemous, as you probably know, Robert, in other traditions. So, for example, in Islam, to say that there are three gods. And I've talked to a number of colleagues and so forth from different traditions who really think that Christianity is, affirming a trilogy, so to speak, not a triunity, but three separate gods. And if that is what's happening, well, then, of course, that would be a problem, even in the Christian tradition, because it's strongly monotheistic. So yes, much work needs to be done here. And I think it's a fruitful discussion happening as we push into looking at what we mean by person and how is God manifest in these three different ways. And I think you can make sense of that without falling into tritheism.
In that sense, when Hinduism has supposedly all these different deities, many would say that those deities are reflections of the one. And so there is a similarity in this justification. I don't use that word in a derogatory sense, but in a literal sense, of explaining how all the Hindu deities, as well, on the Hindu side and on the Christian side, how the three aspects of called the Trinity of God, that those ideas can be harmonized with a monotheistic view. So I think there are similarities that the Hindu have a lot more than three, but once you get over one, you have a problem no matter how many you have.
Yeah, that's a very excellent point you raised there. And if you look at the Hindu tradition, I've spent a fair amount of time studying the Hindu tradition. I was surprised to realize that many Hindus are, in fact, clearly monotheists. In fact, we have a Hindu temple here in our area. And I took my students there on a field trip a couple of years ago. And I was asking the manager there at the temple, they call him the temple manager, the one who oversees, the one who originated the temple itself there in is in charge of it. I asked him about that, and he said, "Well, yes, we believe in one God." And I said, "But what are these statues here? What do they do?" And he said, "Well, they're iconic representations of the one God." He said, "In fact, sometimes they get damaged or something. We just throw them away. We don't really think that these are gods. These are just iconic representations of the one God." And so that's the person who's overseeing the temple here in our area. And when I was in Oxford and talking to Hindu philosophers there, there's many people believe the same thing. A number of Hindus are in fact monotheists, and so I do think that one of the reasons why you have this plethora of expressions of deities in Hinduism is almost the flip side of the commandment not to make any graven images of God on the Abrahamic side. And I think the reason on the Abrahamic side not to make any graven images is because the idea that God is infinite. And so if you make an image, then you're making a finite representation, so you're confusing who God really is. But I think there's an attempt, perhaps on the Hindu side, to have these 333 million deities, as mentioned in the Vedas, as not as a real number, but just as an attempt to say, God is just so big that we can represent God in all these different ways, not that any one of them is capturing who God really is, but to try to give a sense of the vastness and the infinity of God's nature.
Let's talk about the actions of God, Christian versus non-Christian traditions. Is the world created by God out of nothing? And is God necessary to sustain the world? Two separate questions.
Yeah, so in the Christian tradition, the commonly held view is that God created the world ex nihilo, out of nothing, and that the world is sustained by God and must be sustained by God. You find that similar idea in the other Abrahamic traditions. In Hinduism, you find basically a different idea, which is that that the world is eternal. That's a widely held view among Hindu philosophers and Hindu thinkers throughout the centuries. There has been some convergence recently, though, and discussion between these different traditions, in particular in the Christian side among what are called process thinkers. It's not just Christian, but also Jewish and Islamic process thinkers who, many of whom have affirmed that the universe may be eternal. In fact, that the universe may be in some sense a reflection of the nature of God. You also find that in Hinduism.
And the relationship between sustaining and creating, in that if God does not continue an active process of sustaining, everything would go away.
Yes, that is a widely held view, really, across the traditions. Yep.
Okay, let's talk about intervention in human affairs. Does God intervene in human affairs in a special way, not just setting everything in motion? And do those violate the laws of physics?
Yeah. So on the Christian side, again, there's lots of debate, of course, there is across the spectrum here. But in recent decades, there's been quite a bit of discussion on divine action and the role of God in the world. And one way that I think is plausible to think about in terms of how God acts in the world, because I do personally think God does act in the world, but also it seems that God is very constrained, because if God can act in the world, then one might ask, why doesn't he do more to ameliorate pain and suffering? But it could be that God has certain constraints imposed on God by the creation itself. So when God set out the universe, he set certain parameters in place such that he attempted to achieve the goals that he established for this universe. And so then for God to step in and override those would be perhaps undermining the functional integrity of the system that he established. So perhaps God can still work, though, within, say, the probabilistic laws of quantum mechanics to still achieve his goals without violating any laws. I don't think that there is a problem with God violating laws unless the violation is such that it would undermine the integrity of the universe. And then we just have a, kind of a make-believe world where anything can happen. That doesn't seem to be the world God created for many reasons. If that's the case, then there are going to have to be constraints on God.
Yeah, I personally get a bit nervous when we try to go into quantum mechanics and see ways God can work there. Maybe I know too little, or maybe I know too much. I'm not sure.
No, I get nervous too, but I do think, and who knows what quantum mechanics will look like in 50 years from now, right? I get nervous too, but I'm just saying that it does seem to make sense that God could interact in the world without undermining the laws of nature. And I think there are various ways you can do that, whether it's through quantum mechanics or something else. Who knows? But it does seem plausible that God could do that. In fact, one of the questions in philosophy of science is, what are laws of nature anyway?
Sure.
Where are they, and what are they? Yeah.
Sure. That's a whole other topic. We deal with it on Closer to Truth a great deal, between empiricists and realists versus anti-realists, etc. Fundamental question: should religion in general be universalist, in that, with respect to salvation, that all individuals in the ultimate sense will come to redemption?
Yeah, so, in the Abrahamic traditions, I think there have been many people historically that are hopeful universalists. That is, that one would hope that everybody would be saved in the end. But there's also been this strong theme of a libertarian freedom. And so if you have a notion of libertarian freedom in your faith tradition, then it seems perhaps a bit challenging to try to have God determine that everybody would receive salvation, because people could continue to reject the good, reject God, and so forth. In the in the Indian traditions, in Hinduism and Buddhism, you have something very different there, because there they have this cycle where transmigration, where you live in this life and you learn from experiences and so forth, and your soul is shaped. Well, there's not really a soul in most forms of Buddhism, but that aspect of you that continues on, those aspects that continue on are molded and shaped. And it might take maybe millions and millions and millions of eons of lifetimes before one actually is brought into union with the divine. But in those traditions, there's really not a rush to be transformed in this life necessarily, because there's going to be plenty more time for that to happen. Whereas in the Abrahamic faith, the idea historically has been, well, there's this one lifetime, so we need to try to get it right. But again, even in that tradition, as we mentioned earlier, there are inclusivists and exclusivists and pluralists that see salvation a bit differently. And you have universalists in these traditions as well, in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. In the Indian traditions, I think universalism is pretty widely held. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a fundamental nodal point where we can compare the Abrahamic religions with non-Abrahamic religions in terms of this salvation opportunity, because in the non-Christian traditions, you have the karma, the cycles, many different expressions of it, but you have this cycles, and it can take innumerable numbers of times beyond the age of the universe, and all sorts of things like that. So it's a radically different approach to the salvation process.
Yeah, in the Catholic tradition, Catholic Christian tradition, you have another notion called purgatory, which also is held by some Protestants. In this notion of purgatory, in some ways it's similar to what you find in those Indian traditions, because you have this idea of, after this life, a continuation of being shaped and molded and so forth.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let me ask a fundamental question in the relationship between metaphysics and religion. This is what we focus on Closer to Truth. The bedrock ultimate reality. What is ultimate reality? And the way we like to ask that question is by asking what exists. And by that we mean, what are the fundamental, non-reducible categories of all reality?
Yeah. Well, in the Abrahamic traditions, you have God as a non-material reality. That's the historic view. So fundamental reality is God as conscious reality. God is non-physical, mental, spiritual reality. And then on a prominent stream within those traditions, you have a form of theism in which you have God who then creates the world ex nihilo, creates the world out of nothing, which then is a separate reality, so to speak. And this relates to the discussion that's happening today between theists and panentheists, because you have the theists who generally hold that God is a distinct reality from the world. You have the pantheists who hold that there's just one reality, God world. And then the panentheists who hold that God is somehow underlying all of reality, but yet God is not the same thing as reality. God is beyond that reality.
And how do those different traditions within the Christian philosophy of religion relate to other philosophies of religion?
Yeah, so in the Indian traditions, you have, again, lots of debates. Even to call Hinduism a religion is kind of a misnomer because there's so many streams within Hinduism. But to simplify things a bit, you do have a widely held view among most traditions within Hinduism that the world is some kind of an expression of God, and so sometimes the analogy is of the soul and body is used of the world and God. That's a common theme in the Hindu tradition. And so, whereas in the Abrahamic faith, at least historically, the prominent view has not been something like that. Rather, it's been that God is separate from the world. This gets back to, though, the question about divine transcendence and divine immanence. What does it mean to say God is separate from the world if God truly is omnipresent, if God truly is immanent? What does that mean? And I think there's been a strong emphasis on transcendence that's gone so far that it's really separated God from the world in unhelpful ways. And I think we could learn a lot from the Hindu tradition in terms of thinking about God's relation to the world being more immanent.
I have about 330 million more questions from my Hindu experience, but I actually have only time for one more. So this is actually a pretty fundamental one in discerning reality, and that is, what is the relationship between God or deities and consciousness? Because in some traditions, consciousness is the real primary thing. Some believe that only consciousness exists, and that if there is a God, God is an expression of this consciousness. But consciousness as this abstract object that pervades everything is the ultimate reality. And God, if you will, is an expression of that. Of course, in the Abrahamic traditions, God, of course, is aseity and independence, and God maybe created consciousness, at least as we experience it. So talk about this nexus between the concepts of God and consciousness in terms of ultimate reality.
Yeah, so in the Abrahamic traditions, again, you have the notion that God is, in fact, conscious reality. So there's debate about how we break those attributes down, whether we're affirming divine simplicity. We won't go down that path. But the fundamental idea here is that consciousness is fundamental, and non-consciousness depends on consciousness. So you find that, in the Abrahamic traditions. You also find that basic idea widely in the Indian traditions. Consciousness is fundamental, and then reality is an expression or a creation of that consciousness. So one of the interesting, I think, research projects for Christians and Hindus to be working on is, how do we understand this relationship between creation on the one hand and an expression of? What is really the difference? And again, in the Hindu tradition, you find consciousness being fundamental. In fact, in some streams, like the Advaita Vedanta stream, any individual consciences outside of the consciousness of Brahman is illusory. So there is only one consciousness, and that is Brahman consciousness. But in other streams of Hindu thought, you have these individuated consciousnesses, which are, in fact, an expression of the one divine reality. And so, again, I think there's a lot of fruitful work that can be done here, because there are similarities. And then we have to ask, what do we mean exactly by creation? If we're holding to creation ex nihilo, how is that different from an expression of? And are there ways that we can understand these that are similar? What might be some disagreements? So this is a fruitful, I think, research program to engage in.
I think these ideas are terrific and are a great expression of interfaith dialogue. In the past, we've talked about interfaith dialogue on more sociological terms and coexistence terms. But I think philosophy of religion can be a great participant in interfaith dialogue. And we at Closer to Truth look forward to following this over the years and to your work, and look forward to more discussions of the philosophy of religion on a global scale.